Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be looking at the Belgrade Gambit. If you're not too familiar with it, starts out with pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, knight to c3, and knight f6. Getting into the four knights game. A lot of variations that white can go from here. You could get into something crazy like the Halloween's Gambit with knight takes on e5, giving up that knight for a very, very strong attack. But we're going to be looking at more of the main line of pawn to d4. After the pawn takes, now knight up here to d5. And as far as gambits go on the spectrum, you have one end of kind of the Halloween gambit where you're giving up entire pieces like a knight for a very, very strong attack. Super fun to play. And then you have the other extreme, the Queen's Gambit, where you're seeing it at the highest level. At the biggest tournaments, the top players in the world are playing that. Very, very sound. A lot of theoretical chess going into that. This kind of falls in the middle. I wouldn't recommend it if you have a big event or tournament that you're playing, especially if it's a longer game where you have maybe 2 hours for time control. But if you're playing blitz, if you're playing for fun, I think this is completely fine. Fairly sound for white. You're not going to get into crazy positions where you're like, wow, I'm down 3 pieces. Why did I ever play this? It's definitely fun. All in all, I think gambits are a fun way to study the game. And if you do come across it, it's always good to know how you should proceed. There's 4 main lines that I see in this opening, so that we're going to be looking at. The first one is the knight takes on d5. The second one is the knight takes on e4. And then you could also see bishop to e7, or what I see, fairly frequently is the knight down here to b4, attacking the knight here on d5. It is being protected by the bishop up here on f8. So the first line we're going to look at is the knight takes here on d5. And as you can imagine, the white pawn is going to immediately recapture here on d5. Now, because it is attacking the knight's pretty much going to have to move. He could have an in-between move, instead of playing knight down here to b4 or e7, he could decide to go ahead and play queen to e7 first, check, and then, there's the bishop here to e2, getting ready to castle on the king's side, knowing that his pawn here on d4 is not long for this world, is going to end up dying at some point because the knight's going to move, no longer protecting this, and then either the knight or the queen could take it. He could decide to go and just, sacrificial lamb here after the pawn takes. This does block off, this development from the light square bishop, which is how black may proceed, and then knight down here to b4, castle on the king side. But all in all, white's going to have a very good game. He's still kind of blocking off his bishops here. Queen on e7 is not doing anything right now. You could just swing over here, rook to e1, start to put pressure after the bishop moves on the queen. It's going to be chasing it around. This knight here on b4 is not doing a ton. Could capture the material up here on d5, but all in all, I think this is completely fine for white. You may not see the queen come up here to e7. I just like to cover it just to make sure that if you do see it. Now, we're going to be looking at the knight to b4 and e7. We'll look at e7 first. There's kind of 2 options that white has as far as how to continue. The more straightforward is queen up here takes on d4, gets the material back that you lost. You have a very strong attack with, the pawn in the center of the board. Both sides kind of have the same pawn structure going into the endgame, but white has a very easy way to get his light square bishop and his dark square bishop involved into the game. Black on the other side, both of his bishops, very, very difficult to get involved into the game. So all in all, white definitely has a good game from here. I actually prefer a different route because I like to give my opponents more opportunities to make mistakes. And so I prefer pawn up here to d6. And sometimes when you're attacking an opponent's minor piece like this, they decide to go ahead and move that minor piece. So let's swing it back here to c6. If he takes my pawn here on c7, I'll just retake it with my queen. That's going to be fine. But that's not what we're up to here. We're actually going to be looking for queen to e2 check. And since his king can't move, he's going to end up losing material because of our pawn. So he can bring his knight back if he wants to block his bishop. It doesn't matter. We're going to take with our pawn. He's going to go down in material. So that's kind of the play here, especially if your opponent hasn't seen this gambit. Some of these tricks may work on them. Now, if they say, you know what, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to take with my pawn, that's fine too. The knight's going to recapture. And if we kind of look at this, yes, black is up a pawn in material, But as far as the structure on board, I'm going to take white's position all day long. Kind of open up the center of the board for both the bishops to get very, very involved into the game. He has the most central minor piece with the knight here on d4. He has the better pawn structure getting into the endgame. Double pawns here on the d file, and then kind of 3 sets. Just not as good getting into the endgame. It's going to be very difficult for black to continue here. How does he get his light square bishop, or even his dark square bishop, which is very blocked off? How does he castle on the king side? He just doesn't have a lot of good prospects as far as how he continues. Let's go over a few options. If he were to play pawn to b6, maybe he wants to get his light square bishop involved into the game. White could play bishop to c4, starting to attack the weakened f7 square right here, knowing that, okay, if you're gonna focus on the queen side, you're definitely not trying to protect your king over here on the king side. So maybe now knight to c6, getting ready to play bishop d7, castle on the king side. Maybe it's a move too late right now because you could just play castle on the king side here, getting ready to bring your rook over here to e1. If he takes the knight on d4, it's just all sorts of bad because that just gets another valuable piece involved into the game with queen takes on d4. And now bishop to e7, that just loses to queen to g7, attacking the rook right here. Rook comes over here to f8. It's very difficult. You can just have rook to e1, then bishop here to g5. So lots of different attacking lines that we have on board. Now let's say instead of the bishop coming to e7, we see queen to f6. Well, now we can just say queen to e4 check. And then if we see bishop to e7, then the rook here on a8 is going to fall. So that's another attack that we had. Now, if we come back and say, let's not bring queen to f6, we're not even going to worry about the king side of the board. Let's go ahead and say bishop to b7. That was our plan all along. Now rook to e1 is very difficult to deal with. Check, this kind of, if the queen comes to e7, he's going to lose his queen. If he brings his bishop here to e7, then we already talked about it, queen up here to g7. If he plays rook to f8, bishop up here to h6, and you can see this is going to be extremely bad. Now, if we were to come back on board, quite a ways back and say, how do we approach this if instead of the pawn to b6, what if it was just knight to c6? Well, there's kind of two options here. You have one that let's just get to the end game, and I like my pawn structure better, so we'll kind of go with that. And that option looks like this. It's knight to b5, getting ready to attack the square here on d6. And there's not a lot of great ways for black to hold on to this, so we could just play pawn to a6, and then we take here on d6. We recapture a little bit. And he could even decide, I'll go ahead and exchange my queens off the board. And from here, white's going to be completely fine. He still has the double bishop pair. He has a better pawn structure. So if you're looking to get to the end game quickly, you can go this route. If you're not looking to do that, maybe you think you're a much stronger player, and so you want to have more material on board. Instead of playing that knight to b5, you could just play pawn up here to c3. Still allows yourself to get your queen involved into the game if you want to somewhere else. You can get both of your bishops still involved into the game. If you were to take, you can just recapture with your queen. Very aggressive queen on board. He still has that double pawn structure on the d file, so you're going to have a lot of good games here. So that's what happens if you were to try to play that knight to c6. Depending on where else he goes, he just doesn't have tons of great options, so you can really attack depending on where he decides to go. So if we come back to this position and say, well, knight c7 is not the best move. I agree, it's definitely not the best move. If you were to play something like knight to b4, here's kind of my approach. Sometimes you may see bishop to c4 recommended. That's not really my jam. It's not what I'm looking to do here. After queen to e7, am I really going to bring my bishop back here to e2 and then let him push forward with pawn to d3? Or am I really going to be playing king to f1? No, I'm not going to do that. So I don't like the bishop to c4. It does protect my pawn, but at this stage, I'm okay giving up that pawn so I don't have to deal with any shenanigans that black's up to. Instead, I'd kind of go for just pawn to a3. And then after he takes, that's fine. I'll go ahead and take with my queen attacking his knight. If he wants to come back to f6, I can play bishop up here to g5, maybe bishop e7. And then, hey, it's go time. Let's castle on the queen side. I kind of know you're going to be castling on the king side, and this is just an all-out attack, which is why I play a gambit in the first place. If you were to come back and instead of playing knight to f6, maybe queen to e7, now I'm okay with playing the bishop e2 because I didn't move it to c4. I didn't waste a move coming back here to e2. I can castle on the king side a little bit later. This is going to be a fine game for me. Don't make the mistake, though, instead of that pawn to a3, don't think you can come up here to d4. That's a bad life decision. Knight to c2, check, you're going to lose your queen. So just take the safe route. Just play pawn to a3, give up that pawn. You're going to be completely fine and have a good game. The next variation we're going to look at is the knight takes here on e4. Now there's kind of two options. You have the queen to e2, that's pinning down the knight, but I think this just gets a little awkward after pawn to f5. I kind of like this from black. This is a nice little outpost for the knight, and this queen's kind of blocking off my light square bishop. I love getting my light square bishop involved in this particular opening because the king side of black is always weakened, and so if I can get that in a very critical square like bishop to c4 and really attack the king side of the board, I think that's really good. This stops me from doing that, so I don't like playing queen to e2, which you may see in some places. Instead, I like a bishop here to d3. This attacks the knight. It also allows me to later on play queen to e2 if I want to. So there's a few ways that black can stop this. One of those we kind of looked at if he plays pawn to f5, and here's the approach if he does that. Take the knight right away. He's going to 100% of the time take back with his pawn, and you're going to castle on the king side, kind of baiting him to go ahead and take your knight right here. But if he does, it's going to be a mistake. Pawn takes here on f3, and you're just going to be playing rook over here to e1. Very, very difficult for him to kind of stop this. And we've looked at this briefly because the bishop to g5, because that's such a strong attack. Let's kind of look at a few options. If he plays knight to e7, try to stop it. Bishop up here to g5. This knight's being pinned down to the king from the rook, and it's also being pinned down by the bishop to the queen right here. So, what does he do now? I can't move the knight. If he plays pawn to c6, trying to break up our knight right here, that's fine. Just go ahead and take with our knight. There's a discovered attack, so he kind of needs to take it. If we take, he takes, then the queen is going to fall. There's no square that he can go to where we can't just have a discovered attack. Bishop here to c5, you can see check. He's going to end up losing that queen. So he's pretty much just going to have to play queen takes, rook up here. After the king takes, then queen up here to d4. This should be a very, very easy endgame for white to go to. If instead of the knight coming here to e7, he could decide to play bishop to e7. Same kind of thing, bishop to g5. Maybe in this particular case, he can castle on the king side. That's one nuance that's a little bit different. But now you could just take with your knight if you want to. Maybe knight takes. Now the rook can come up here to e7. And then, pawn up here to d5, opening up the door for the light square bishop. But then rook over here to g7 check. After the king takes, bishop takes on d8. Do lose some material, yes, but still have that queen on board and a queen going into the endgame, especially when the board state is very open. You can really attack your opponent's kings, put a lot of pressure on any other piece on the board with a check and attacking that. It's going to be very difficult for black to kind of hold on to here. So that's kind of what it looks like if they just take that piece right here on f3, which we kind of know is a mistake. If for some reason he says, you know what, I'm not even going to worry about this right now. I'm instead going to play king to f7. Well, we kind of can see that's a huge mistake with queen to f3. That's not even trying to be safe. This king's just going to be under attack for the rest of the game. That's going to be very, very bad. So if instead of f5, we kind of looked at that and said that's fairly good for white. I'm okay if he plays a pawn to f5 in this position. He could decide to go ahead and move his knight. Could play knight to f6, and then we have the queen to e2 as we talked about. If he wants to block it, that's fine. We could go ahead and take with our knight right here. He can't take it back with his bishop because it is being pinned down. So when he recaptures, it does have a weakened king side, weakened pawn structure. He has 2 double pawns on the D and F file. I'm completely fine as white going into the endgame in this position. If instead of knight to F6, maybe he decides to go ahead and bring it over to the queen side of the board, maybe knight to C5. This is probably a little bit better from black. And so I play castle on the king side instead of that queen to E2 because now the knight can come back here to E6. Even if he were to decide to play bishop to E7 first and then knight to E7 or E6, this does block off more, and so I don't know that the queen here on E2 is really doing what I want it to. So instead, I'd rather just castle on the king side. If he plays bishop here to E7, then you could just swing over here rook to E1 if you wanted to, or if you really just wanted to get his bishop pair off the board, you could go ahead and take here on E7 as well. You have some options. The next option that we'll look at is bishop here to E7. Kind of a safe move. It immediately says, I'm not sure what you're doing with this gambit, but I want to castle on the king side as fast as possible to get some safety. I'm kind of up a pawn in material, so I don't want to do anything too crazy. And you have a few options here. I kind of have what I consider the bailout plan, which is man, I wish he hadn't played E7. Let's just go ahead and exchange material off on board and I can have a good end game and we'll be okay with that. And that plan usually looks like this. Knight takes on D4, knight takes on D5. We see some exchange on board. All of a sudden, queen up here to D4, and you're good. Both sides equal in material. You both have a double bishop pair. No side's really that much better off. I mean, an active queen in the center, but that's pretty much it. He doesn't necessarily have to go along with all your plans, after you decide to go ahead and, take with... if he plays bishop here to E7 and you decide to go ahead and take, he could decide to play something crazy. Knight takes on E4. But if he plays knight to E4, here's kind of how I like to approach it with knight to B5. This is having both your knights attack here on C7, which would fork the rook here on A8. That would definitely be a win. But from here, you could see castle on the king side. And then you could play bishop up here to D3, forcing the knight to move. If he tried to play that, pawn to F5, we've kind of seen that before. Castle on the king side, this is going to be good for white. If he instead decides to just bring his knight back here to F6, then yeah, let's go ahead and start taking material. He could decide to go ahead and play knight takes here. Knight comes back here. This is going to be fine for white. You can now castle on the king side. So you kind of have your bailout plan. If he doesn't go along with your plan, you still have a nice backup here. I like a different approach. I don't necessarily like to just go with the bailout plan because I don't mind if he plays bishop to E7 early on. So if he does decide to go and play bishop E7, I'm more of the bishop to F4. I like to be pretty aggressive on board, get more of the bishops involved into the material. If you're going to play somewhat passive with bishop to E7, castle on the king side, I'm going to develop as much material as possible. Now, a few moves that he does have, if he plays bishop to B4, I'm fine with this. He's moved his bishop twice. That's not really what I would recommend. I would go ahead and take my knight, or with my knight, if he recaptures, that's fine. Now we play that same pawn to A3 that we saw earlier. Now maybe knight to C6, push our pawn up to E5, forcing the knight here on F6 to move. Then we can get our light square bishop involved into the game, more than likely here to C5 or C4, starting to put more pressure on our opponent's king side. And he hasn't even castled yet, even though this was kind of his game plan early on with that bishop to E7, he hasn't done this. Now if he decides, okay, I brought my bishop here to E7, not so I can move it again. If he decides to go ahead and take our knight here on D5, that's fine. We can just recapture if he wants to. Maybe now knight down here to B4. But then that pawn to D6 move. We saw this earlier in some variations. This is still a very, very strong attack that we have on board. So I like to go ahead and point that out. I like that D6 move. Or if he decides, instead of any of that, he could play just pawn to D6. Great. We can just go ahead and take that material here on D4. Gain that material back. We have a very strong presence in the center. We can get our light square bishop involved into the game, castle on the king side. All in all, in all these variations we've looked at, at no point has black really put us in a bind where we're like, wow, I hope he doesn't play this because then we're in a really bad spot, which is really nice. I like a gambit that allows my opponent to make mistakes, but at the end of the day, if he plays optimally, I'm still in a decent spot. Now, the last variation that we're going to be looking at, instead of bishop to e7, he could play knight down here to b4. And I have been seeing this, more and more. And you have kind of two options. One is what I like to call a fight for the d4 square. And so it looks like this. You could go ahead and take here on f6 if you want to. He could recapture, then pawn here to a3, knight comes back here to c6. A lot of these are somewhat forced. Bishop here to c4, bishop to c5. You can see a lot of pressure being put on this d4 square. We could try to kick this back, so pawn up here to b4, kicks it back, get our dark square bishop involved into the game. Also attacking the pawn here in the center of the board, castle on the king side. You can see black's going to be up a pawn in material, and both sides are just fighting for this square. So that is a fight if you want to do that. If instead you decide that's not really the path that I want to go, you also have the option after the knight comes down here to b4 of just playing bishop up here to c4. I think this is completely fine. It's kind of a coin toss in my head that I would make as far as which one I would choose to do. Do keep in mind, though, if they take with either the knight, doesn't matter if they take it with their b knight or if they're going to be taking it with their f knight, recapture with your pawn, don't recapture with your bishop. This is going to play extremely well. It's going to allow you to castle on the king side, get your rook over here to e1. Then later on, if you wanted to play that pawn to d6, you do have some options with that. Also, get that dark square bishop involved into the game. With the pawn here, that's going to be a very, very strong attack. So I really like that. Also, make sure that your opponent doesn't recapture. If your bishop's here, he can recapture with his knight. You want to hold on to that double bishop pair in this opening. So that's kind of an introduction to the Belgrade Gambit. As many of you have requested from me this particular gambit. If you have other openings that you would like to see me cover, feel free to email me at the chess website at Gmail. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. Try it out and let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.